Welcome back, everybody. So, in our second session of the day, we're still talking about the future, the idea of constructing new cities and new futures in the world. We have three wonderful talks. I'll introduce every speaker just before their talks, and then we'll have the questions at the end of the talks. Our first speaker is Professor Nimi Wariboko. He's the Catherine B. Stewart Professor of Christian Ethics at Andover Newton Theological School. He received his PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary. He also holds an MBA in Finance and Accounting from Columbia University and worked as an investment banker on Wall Street, but he's not giving any financial advice today. Professor Wariboko's scholarship, unless you change your mind, if you want. Professor Wariboko's scholarship focuses on economic ethics, philosophical theology, and Pentecostal studies. He has authored or edited more than 16 volumes. I will only mention two of them. The most recent, God and Money, A Theology of Money in a Globalizing World in 2008, and the Pentecostal Principle, Ethical Methodology in New Spirit in 2012. His talk today is entitled The Charismatic City, Religious Sense and Sensibility for Future Urban Design.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you. First of all, let me give you a sense of what I mean by the charismatic city. I've named the future city, the charismatic city, to signal 5 points. One is to signal a spiritually awakened city, a city that is designed to recognize the spirit and spirituality of human beings. Number 2, a city that will maximize emotional energy for all seeking human beings. It's to acknowledge the city as a global city without foundation and without borders, in the sense that it's a connection of different cities. That is the way the world is going, that cities are emerging, that is a matter of connecting different cities. And it's to upgrade the idea of the secular city, which with modernity, Havikos in 1965 talk about rationalization and routinization. So the idea of the city as a philosophical and theological concept was what Havikos did in 1965, and he named it the secular city. It was not any particular city, but the whole philosophical idea of the nature of city in modernity. And I'm saying today, given the resurgence of spirituality and religion, given the whole talk we've had this morning about awe and about spirituality and about finding God, I think we need a different concept of a city, something different from the secular city into what I call the charismatic city. And the 5th point is to recognize, or what I call, the awe-philic city. We've heard about biophilic, but I think I'm talking about awe-philic city. The city that loves awe and wonder. The city that generates awe and wonder. The city that generates charisma. And that is what I mean by the charismatic city. So how do we, it's both something that's happening now, it's both an utopia, but how do we design our cities to reflect that? I'll read from my paper a bit, then I will show you a chart to look at the historical evolution of the city from what I call the sacred city to the secular city and to the era of the charismatic city. There's a way in religion you can think about how the cities have evolved to what we have as a charismatic city. I said this paper presents the concept of the future city as a charismatic city. We consider the charismatic city as the tellers of human flourishing in a global context. The argument of the paper is that it's only when we have adequately understood the form, function, and meaning of this emerging cosmopolitan civilization shot through with transnational spiritual energies that we can design the future city to promote well-being, maximize emotional energy, and ultimately to advance the actualization of human potential. We conclude with a suggestion of an ethical framework that can guide urban designers towards creating a more psychologically and spiritually satisfying urban experience. To design the future city, we need only to look to the future, a future that is constituted as a palimpsest, one that is precipitated out of the past and the present paradigmatic form of the city, both sacred and secular, and bears unique features in itself. The charismatic city does not refer to any one place, but to interactive networks of places and flows. The city is a space of new beginning, new thinking, new energies, and renewed religious intensity in every continent or country. It is a place of gift, charis, and charisma, linked sites embedded in trans-territorial networks of people and activities. The charismatic city is a network of energy flows that is initiating something new amidst ongoing social reality. It is a local, global place where events happen that exceed the conditions of possibility understood in advance by the agents. In sum, it is a place of new beginning. The question now is, what distinctively Christian ethics can we offer to understand this new city, this new Jerusalem, the global civil society that can address its moral convictions? And the Bible talks about the New Jerusalem, which is never really a place, but it's the idea of an emerging global civilization. It's never like a physical place. And I think the world is becoming that as we are having this global city connection. There is now a global articulation of cities or segments of cities in a worldwide network society or agglomeration. This new creation does not refer to any one metropolis or place, but to interactive networks of places and connectivities in communication, transportation, and their relationship. Some have called this trans-territorial network the global city, the world city, new creation. Actually, as far back in 1961, Winter Gibson called it the new creation. He saw this coming. Or the urban cosmopolitan civilization, as Max Stackhouse would call it. We will call it the charismatic city. The name is selected to mark a fresh conception of the future city in 5 distinct but related ways. First, we conceive the global city as an emerging New Jerusalem, a site of more intense participation in God's presence. It is a space for the work of the Spirit, a site of transeminence. The Spirit is involved in the gritty materiality of human sociality, animating and reanimating it to exhibit charis and charisma, and to manifest and actualize maximum goodness. The idea of the world city as the New Jerusalem calls for a different starting point for inquiry into the socio-historical analysis of the formation of the cosmopolitan urban reality. Second, we situate the global city as imbricated within contemporary explosion of energy flows, a phenomenon of our epoch. We are in an era governed by worship of bold, rapid, abundant energies, from gorging oil wells, as we saw in 2010, to chain reaction of atomic explosion, from race cars to space shuttles, from action movies to bungee jumping, from supersonic chats of cell phone text messages to the profound, instantaneous, and infinite speed of the internet. Everything is in the mode of explosion and detonation. As Peter Slontage puts it, we are all fanatical adherents of explosion, worshippers of that rapid release of large quantity of energy. The formation of the world city is affected and permeated by supranational or global spiritual energies. Pentecostalism, in its fury, exorbitant energy, and rapid growth, is the religious archetype of the impetus of our age. Pentecostal charismatic movements, with their intense, exploding spiritual energies, that are not only trans-territorial, but also work and prosper through the same transport and communication technology condition the ethos of the world city. But often scholars have ignored these movements in the analysis of the future city. This essay gives prominence to Pentecostal sensibility in our thinking about ethics of the emerging global society. Third, we have named the future city the charismatic city in order to highlight the need for a design of cities that will better promote and maximize emotional energy in the interaction ritual chains that structure and destructure cities as space of flows and space of places. What I'm suggesting here is the need for urban designers to pay attention to the kinds of interactional situation among a city's populace that enable the city to acquire emotional significance, or even to become charismatic in the Durkheimian sense, that is, to become a symbolic repository of people's emotional energy. What mechanism can be built into cities' life to produce and promote awe or moral solidarity, to hold it together? Following Emile Durkheim and sociologist Randall Collins, we argue that we do so by focusing, intensifying, and transforming emotions. A city is a multiplicity of emotional patterns of social interactions. We maximize the feeling of psychological well-being and solidarity of a city's interactional situation if there are sites or opportunities for mutual focus of attention to occur and emotional entrainment to build up among its dwellers and visitors. And I'm quoting Randall here, he said, where mutual focus and entrainment becomes intense, self-reinforcing feedback processes generate moments of compelling emotional experience. This in turn become motivational magnets and moments of cultural significance. A well-designed city is like a successful social ritual, which enables its participants to feel strong, secure, hopeful, and either motivated to initiate something new, or at least to take the initiative. The secret of a successful social ritual, according to Durkheim, is the generation of high emotional energy and being an emotional transformer. We have often designed cities for economic efficiency, cost, time reduction, and maximization of economic gains. But this type of cost-benefit analysis ignores benefits of emotional payoffs of participation and interaction in the city. And Collins argues that humans are not very good at calculating costs and benefits, but they feel their way towards goals because they can judge everything subconsciously by its contribution to a fundamental motive, seeking maximal emotional energy in interaction rituals. Fourth, by conceptualizing the city as a chain of interaction rituals and a place traversed by strong flows of energy, we open a path for us to interpret it as a real visuality, according to the philosopher Deleuze, or as a plastic organ, according to the philosopher Catherine Malabou, or the brain specialist, that the city is also a plastic, it has its own plasticity. Building on Deleuze's insights in difference and repetition, we argue that the city is not mere a container or inert receptacle in which people live and act, but it's a kind of numinal machinery behind the millions of interactional situations and phenomena. The city is real visuality that conditions the genesis of the forms of interactional rituals. Following Malabou, we state that the city as a world of material and energetic flows engendered by millions of micro interaction rituals is characterized by plasticity. This refers to three properties of the city. It possesses at once the capacity to receive form and the capacity to give form. But it must also be remarked that that plasticity is also the capacity to annihilate the very form it's able to receive or create. Finally, this essay simultaneously reverses and updates the argument of the secular city as put forward in the 1960s by scholars such as Harvey Kurtz. Since God has refused to die, and the divine presence has failed to deteriorate in its dispersal from sacred center or temples as the secularists expected, how should we theologically thematize the future city, given the upsurge of religion and spirituality in the 21st century? The thesis of the charismatic city does not totally refute the resurgent spirituality, or it does not totally refute the arguments of the secular city, but takes it up and develops it in a different way based on the resurgent spirituality of today. The charismatic city is constituted as a palimpsest. It is precipitated out of the sacred and the secular cities. It is superimposed on these forms of the city and may therefore, in particular times, assumes qualities reflective of them. The notion of the charismatic city shifts the focus of the intent of the secular city from the Weberian rationalization and routinization to improvisation of charisma and awe. We want the intent of the city to be awe-philic. The intent of the modern city was more of rationalization and efficiency. But now the intent of the future city should be awe-philic, as we've seen in the morning. I would then, how does this work?
Lower right.
I want to move. Okay, yeah. Sorry. Okay. And here I show an historical evolution, a theological historical evolution of the city. If we understand, on one hand, you put what they call the voluntary principle and the dispersal of the city. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the argument of the secular city, people as put up by Abikos and others, it was not that God was dead, really, in the 60s. What happens is that God has moved out of the sacred places and is now dispersed, immersed in every area of human activity. So there is no more one central place where you meet God as a sacred temple, but you encounter God everywhere. And that is one of the key fundamental ideas of the secular city era. And then, the voluntary principle, the Christian principle of the church, the fundamental principle of the church here is that a church calls you out of your family, your gene pool, your tribe, your nation, into this middle ground, to this almost like a civil society in between the family and the state. That is what theologically is called the voluntary principle. You are not a member of the church because of your color, your birth, or whatever you are called out of your family. It's not you are born into a caste, you are born. So you are called out of that environment into a middle state, and the church was never to take over the political realm. So it was in between the family and the politics. Of course, in the Christendom, this failed, and this much was even mentioned in the secular city. So, and then, if on this other axis, you have what they call the divine presence. Do we conceive a city as a place where God is concentrated or the presence of God is dispersed? So if you look at the concept of the sacred city all through history, and I'm just here giving a generalized idea, the idea is that there's a place, there's a city where God is more present than any other place. And it's best to worship God there. And so God is concentrated. But on the voluntary principle, you are born into that religion, or you are born onto that land, and that what makes you can benefit from that sacred city. So if on this axis, then the sacred city believes in concentration of God's presence. At the same time, it is very low on the voluntary, not that it's not there, it's very low on this voluntary principle that you are there. Now the secular city idea put up by Abikos and his colleague then was that God is dispersed. But if you look at the secular city idea with the era of church denomination and nationalism, as William Connelly of Johns Hopkins has shown, the secular city or the secular idea was too tied to the idea of nations. Because before the era of globalization, where the city is more like connection of networks of cross cities, it was still defined by the borders of nations or so. So it is somewhat also low on the voluntary principle. Right? And the church, it's high on the voluntary principle, but still believe that, well, God is here. God is in the church, and my religion is better than the others. So we have more claim on God's presence. And that's one of the things that the secular city idea was contested, that if there is no more a center to God, therefore no one can claim to have an authoritative stand or can define the comprehensive moral value or view of society. But the idea of the charismatic city is that it's a city that believes that we can encounter God any place. There's no one special place. And indeed, it is very high on the voluntary principle. You don't need to participate in this era of globalization, in this era of connection between cities based on your birth or your caste or your skin color, white or black. So it opens it up. It's a global urban civilization. So we are connected. So the city is not necessarily New York. We'll be part of New York with Mumbai and part of Cairo, part of Lagos, Nigeria, and we're all participating in this. So the problem is that now the city doesn't have any borders or boundaries anymore. And how do you design, as an architect, you are called to design the city, but you only have to design it at a place. But how to design it with this view that we have a global civil society has emerged, a global cosmopolitan civilization that connects people across all borders, and believe that we can encounter God. Because the idea we learned this morning that you can encounter God when you walk the park, when we do this, you are based on the idea of a dispersed presence of God. If that is not true, the only idea of what we're talking this morning is thrown out. Because if God is only present at a particular authorized places, then this idea of seeking awe in where you go is being defeated. So that's what I call, if you look at historical evolution, through this lens of voluntary principle, and whether God is dispersed or concentrated will take us to what I mean by the charismatic city. And therefore, the question of the ethical focus of the city is, how do you design, how will the ethics influence your design? And I'm saying we can design city with what they call love, power, and justice of the city. I'm picking from the work of Paul Tillich, his book on Love, Power, and Justice. But the question is, how can the city be designed to promote friendship? Because one thing that Aristotle said in his book on the Polities, book 2, was a city is where strangers meet and they come together. And friendship is a way of forming bonds. And he went to the length about how the city should be designed, not more than 100,000 in its own area. There's a space for public meeting, for sacrifice. There are a lot of things. So he was saying that but the key to a city's survival is the ability to build up friendship, which will create connections between people. And that this network of connections is what will sustain the city. So the question is, the way we design the cities of the future, will it promote friendship? Or it will not promote friendship. So that do we have pockets of network of people and relationships that make the city alive and give the city its emotional significance? I mean, that is the challenge that I want us to think through. How can the city promote friendships? How can the city promote pockets of civic unions? And this was the question he was handling in his on the issue of the politics. And of course, even in the Christian era, Jesus Christ said, "I do not call you servants, I call you friends." And that's an important concept. So how should that influence the way we design the cities to promote friendship, rather than people ever remaining separate individuals without connection? And I think that is not just a matter of the attitude of the time. It's also a way our cities have been designed. Or how can we change that? And then I talk about what I call the space and time values of city. And my first training was an economist, actually taught in a business school, professor in a business school. And so in economics, especially if you go back to classical economics, we talk about the space and time value of money. And this concept is the idea that how does the money connect different spaces together, bring people together, and what is the value of the money over time? And I'm bringing that concept to the design of cities. That we look at the cities in a way that different segments of cities are connected. How do we design the cities? That yes, a city is normally little pockets and villages or several within a city. But can we find a way to measure the spatial connection between segments of the city? Because it's this idea of of the question of friendship. There are different segments of the city integrated within itself or within others. And if it's a little bit difficult for but think about it in a third world country. The economy of a third world country usually is not integrated within itself. It's integrated to Paris, London, or New York. So the segments of economies are there, but they are not integrated. And a city could also have that kind of life. That different sectors, both economic sectors and both physical segments of the cities are operating without an integral link. And the question is, that's what I mean by the space value of a city, not the real estate value of the city. It's a different concept. And in question of the time value, means that how does the city promote the actualization of human beings? If you take the list of the people in the city, let's say the poorest people, over time, is that city making them worse or better? Or do we use something like the UN the development HDI index, human development index, and zero it down to cities or so? Is the design of Boston improving the human development index of the people in Boston, or even the small segment or the poorest in the Boston? Is the city promoting creativity, the actualization of human potential? Because that's for Aristotle is part of the concept of eudaimonia. That how do you create a city that will enable a person to become the best that he or she can be? And so we are bringing this concept of ethics and philosophy into the city. To say, how do you design a city that maximizes the actualization of human potential of everyone in the city? And how do you actually measure that? I have not found a very precise way to measure it, but I'm really reasonable for us to think that we need to think about the city in terms of the space value means the interconnection or interconnectedness between segments, the physical segment and economic sectors of the city. And also in terms of the time value, over time, is this city promoting human development? What is the human development index of this city over time? What is its ability to promote actualization of human potential of the least of people, of the poorest in the city? And these are things that we need to put into the city. And therefore, if all those things are there, to promote more of the emotional significance of the city. And the question is economic justice. How do you design a city that it creates a space for the poorest people to also be at the table? And if the table has no space to them, we discard that table and construct a different table or so. So how do we look at the economic justice of the city? Because the way cities are designed has an impact on the economic well-being of the people, especially the people in the lowest class. And so how do we begin to, in the design of the city, while we are going for this philic and other things, but the economic significance, what is its impact, the way the city is designed, on the survival of the poorest? And so, because if one of the goals of the world is to eliminate poverty by the Millennium Development Goals, it's not only an economic matter, but it's also a matter of how do we design cities to do that. And so I would go straight ahead to read my summary and conclusion. I said the city has always had its boundaries, be it its enclosing walls, dishes around its periphery, forests, rivers, rail tracks, or national borders. We have always had ways to mark its limit, but in this essay we have attempted to think of the design of the future city as one having no boundaries and no foundation. And in this process, we are revisioning the sense of the city. In the charismatic sense of the world, rather than say the secular sense, there is no position, there is no partition between exterior and interior, outside and inside. The secular city is the preservation of the modern city as such. The charismatic city, for its part, is the movement towards, or is the city that is coming into presence. It's a movement towards the New Jerusalem. This network of networks is not a place, rather it is a worldwide opening of space that is coming towards us with the sluggishness of creative technology, the infinite coming of cosmopolitan witness, an almost immobile speed of movement towards universal human rights. As if all this is not enough, we have tried to think of the ethos of the future city in terms of erotic weaving or knotting of residents together towards a citywide koinonia. And in theology of philosophy, it means fellowship. We dreamed of picking up the bare threads of friendship to weave a new political life, of taking up persons of bare life, as in Agaben, bare life into a flourishing life, and have to venture to formulate a threadbare metric of space-time values of life in the commons. This is the knot of the city. And it involves the effort of endless and perichoretic weaving. A city is not something that is there. We always, if we think of a city as a set of relationships, how do we always weave this city to have a perichoretic ending? And in Christian theology, perichoretic means mutuality. So how do we think of a city not as a set of bricks, but as a set of social relations that is being played out? The drama of social relations, either as Jane Jacobs said, the urban street city drama, or Moffat, the play of the city. How do we begin to design city, thinking that it's primarily a set of relationships? And how will that relationship have the gifts and the charisma and the emotional energy that will support a flourishing human life? And that is the idea of the future city as a charismatic city. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Thomas Barry. He's Professor of Architecture and Director of Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Initiative at North Carolina State University College of Design. His research focuses on alternative histories of architecture and in particular the interrelationship of a culture's architecture and its cultural, religious beliefs and communal rituals. And he also focuses on broadening the scope and audience of architecture through research, extension, and community-based design studios in housing and urban design. His books include The Architecture of the In-Between, The Mediating Roles of Architecture in Routledge in 2010, and The Spiritual Path, Sacred Place, Myth, Ritual, and the Meaning of Architecture in 1996. His paper today will be entitled City House, House City, the Timeless, the Timely, and the Future City. Don.
It's a pleasure to be here at this conference that has been in my mind and I know many others' minds for quite some time. Right, so today this paper presents concepts of the city as a house and home as a means to construct an argument regarding the spiritual context of urbanism and the limitations, complexity, and promises of theorizing the future city. Its principal argument is because traditionally one of the roles of the built environment was to symbolize the world and humans' position within it. Conceptualizing the city as a house and home may productively contribute to explicating the perennial human quest for building a home in the world. The condition of homelessness and the desire for homecoming, for founding and inhabiting a home, describe in part the human condition. Even though homelessness has often been described as a modern condition of alienation, it appears throughout Western philosophic and religious traditions. Examples from the Pythagorean and Platonic schools include inferences to human existence as one of exile and imprisonment in incarnate life. Plato's allegory of the cave describes the isolation of humans lost in a sensible world. Homelessness, of being cast adrift in the world as the primary subject of the Odyssey, where Odysseus must wander for years before returning home. But even upon arrival, as I know most of you know, he must appear as a stranger, symbolizing the degree of his estrangement from home. The perennial condition of dislocation from the world, the lost Eden, is evocatively described, of course, in Genesis. Man eats from the tree of knowledge and subsequently is alienated from the paradise garden where such separation does not exist. In the Hebrew tradition, humans are often characterized as lost and wandering, separated and homesick for an elusive God. David cries in the Psalms, "How long will you hide your face from me? How long?" In the pre-modern, questions regarding human existence in the world were embedded in religion. In the modern, they typically emerge from confrontations with scientific discoveries and the attendant social and cultural displacements. The Christian philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal wrote in Thoughts that in contemplating the universe, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces fills me with dread, articulating the mystery and even terror of human existence. The emergence of non-dogmatic thought and recognition of an autonomous human rationality also resulted in the loss of certitude of belief. Martin Heidegger identified the capacity of humans to view the world from a separate individual perspective as a source of anxiety, an intrinsic part of the human condition. When one is no longer enclosed within the limits of their world, in the homeland, then broader perspectives appear. In seeking to understand the world, we must paradoxically stand apart from it. And this separation from the familiar we feel as anxiety. For Heidegger, homelessness was an enduring philosophic theme. Uncanny homelessness was a condition of estrangement from the familiar, provoking a mood of homesickness and desire for homecoming. Robert Mugarara, in his recent book, Heidegger and Homecoming, the leitmotif of the later writing states, quoting, "Insofar as a displacement would be metaphysical, collapsing our grounding and orientation in the world cosmos, it would be seen that a recovery would require, or even amount to, an ontological homecoming." But he adds, matters are not so simple. The Western literary tradition is also replete with ruminations on the ontological condition of homelessness. Thomas Wolfe famously stated, North Carolina's own Thomas Wolfe, "You can't go home again," in the 1940 novel of the same name. The novel's protagonist, George Weber, asserts, quoting, "You can't go back home to your family, back home to your childhood, back home to a young man's dreams of glory and fame, back home to places in the country, back home to the old forms and systems of things which once seemed everlasting but which are changing all the time, back home to the escapes of time and memory," end quote. Wolfe's pronouncement has become, I think as we know, a common expression that means many things, including once we've left our childhood, our hometown, our previous ways of being, we can never return to them and find them the same as before. Now, Wolfe more compellingly describes the condition of dislocation at the beginning of his 1929 novel, Look Homeward, Angel. "Naked and alone we came into exile. In her dark womb we did not know our mother's face. From the prison of her flesh have we come into the unspeakable and incommunicable prison of this earth. Which of us has known his brother? Which of us has looked into his father's heart? Which of us has not remained forever prison pent? Which of us is not forever a stranger and alone?" O waste of loss in the hot mazes, lost among bright stars on this most weary unbright cinder lost. Remembering speechlessly we seek the great forgotten language, the lost land and into heaven. A stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Where? When? It must be abstract. The American poet Wallace Stevens describes the special role of the arts to address the human condition outlined by Woolf. He writes, "The first idea was not our own. The clouds preceded us. There was a muddy center before we breathed. There was a myth before the myth began. Venerable and articulate and complete." And he goes on, "From this the poem springs, that we live in a place that is not our own and much more not ourselves, and hard it is in spite of blazoned days." Other writers have examined the human condition through the lens of the city. Rainer Maria Rilke, in the notebooks of Malte Lorenz Brigg, poetically addressed the ephemerality of human existence through the description of a Parisian townhouse, whose rooms are revealed by the demolition of its adjoining building. The tenacious life of these rooms was revealed by its exposed surfaces, layers, structure, and services in a manner that, Rilke later admitted, elicited feelings of dread such that he fled in horror. Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical writings have always been associated with Copenhagen and his years restlessly wandering its streets and engaging in its life. Walter Benjamin shared Rilke's fascination with the palimpsest of the city, and in the Arcades project, he presents himself as a flaneur, a disinterested, aloof wanderer through the famous cast-iron arcades of Paris to confront the anonymity of the modern condition. For the Turkish author Orhan Pamuk, the city of Istanbul, which defined his childhood, is essential to his melancholic biography. In his words, "The city offered me a deeper wisdom and understanding than any I could acquire in a classroom." These brief examples express the promise or futility of situating oneself in the world through the city, congruent with the human story of the recognition that we inhabit a world that is not of our own making, and one often capricious and indifferent to our needs. This, as Stevens explains, is the birth of poetry, of the myriad of artistic impulses and compulsions whose aim is to create some semblance of place, a home in the world. Vitruvius, in his observations on the origins of the dwelling house, states that it was the unique human capacity to stand upright and gazing upon the splendor of the starry firmament to realize and consider their place in the universe. That was, in part, the impetus for the birth of architecture. Considerations of the temporal nature of human existence and death, along with questions regarding the world and our place within it, may have been the perennial subject of religion and philosophy, but are not limited to these mediums. Carson Harries, in his essay, The Terror of Time, suggests that acts of building serve as a domestication of space, and every house may be considered an attempted recovery of some paradise. Humans have demanded that architecture not only shelter them from the storms of the environment, but from the storms of existence as well. For Harry's, architecture has a particular function of embodying the timeless and consequently ameliorating the reality of the passage of time and its implications regarding mortality. Spiro Kostoff observed that from the earliest architecture, humans finding themselves in a world not of their making sought ways to construct their world. Carson Harries discusses this topic at some length in The Ethical Function of Architecture. In referencing the Stevens poem, argues that poetry and myths, and by extension other art forms such as architecture, serve to represent the world that it no longer seems indifferent to our needs, arbitrary and contingent, but is expressed as a place we call home. According to Harries, architecture has a special and perhaps preeminent role which answers to the human need to experience the social and natural world as a non-arbitrary, meaningful order. Norman Crowe suggests that with Eden left behind, humans needed a new garden, one permanently positioned in the world of time and place, end quote. The perennial quest for order and stability in an often capricious and unpredictable world produced the need for a new nature of the domicile and the settlement, what Cicero described as a second world within the world of nature. However, even though the simplest of domiciles and settlements may have served as a new nature, they were also positioned as part of nature, with alignments to cardinal points and environmental features that served to link them to the order of the world around them. Houses themselves often served as cosmograms, where the roof represented the sky, the smoke hole the sun, the walls boundaries of the cosmos. For the Navajo, the Hogan, given by their god in their Blessing Way myth, represented their world and ordered their lives. Architecture, in replicating nature, also served to explicate it. I now turn more specifically to the city and return to the suggestion that we may productively reposition our conceptions of urbanism by conceptualizing it as a house or home. Admittedly, this is a theoretical stretch. But, as it turns out, fortunately, I'm not the only one to have done so. Leon Battista Alberti, On the Art of Building in 10 Books, stated, quoting, "The city is like some large house, and the house is in turn like some small city," end quote. This was poetically expanded 5 centuries later by the Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck as, quoting, "Tree is leaf, and leaf is tree. House is city, and city is house. A tree is a tree, but is also a huge leaf. A leaf is a leaf, but is also a tiny tree. A city is not a city unless it is also a huge house. A house is a house only if it is a tiny city." What do each of these theoreticians mean by these assertions? In Book 1 of Alberti's treatise, he states that architecture requires compartition. Its success depends on a harmonious relationship between its parts in service of a Vitruvian-inspired goal of a single harmonious work that respects utility, dignity, and delight. His reference to the city as a large house, to which he also defers to his predecessors with the phrase, "as the philosophers maintain," is in service of describing the house like some small city and the skillful arrangement of its rooms. Quoting, "The parts ought to be so composed that their overall harmony contributes to the honor and grace of the whole work, and that effort is not expended in adorning one part at the expense of all the rest, but that harmony is such that the building appears a single, integral, and well-composed body rather than a collection of extraneous and unrelated parts," end quote. The reference to the body is not incidental. Plato in the Republic compared the city with the body of a man. And Alberti in the prologue of his treatise states, quoting, "We observe that the building is a form of body, which like any other consists of lineaments and matter." In Book 5, Alberti references his theoretical construct of Book 1 and goes on to describe the goals of the city and the house as the same. Quoting, "It should be extremely healthy. It should offer every facility and every convenience to contribute to a peaceful, tranquil, and refined life," end quote. But He then abruptly goes on to discuss how this is achieved in private buildings. Alberti's text may address the value of the rational ordering of the city, but his principal agenda is in the house. Moreover, according to some, it was in service of reinforcing the social and political hierarchies of his time. Casper Pearson states, quoting, "Unsurprisingly, both the house and the city used the division and arrangement of space to impose a moral order," end quote. Although Van Eyck, on the other hand, though clearly aware of Alberti's model, had a broader, more humanistic agenda, one more congruent with the topic of this paper. His conceptualizations of the house as city and city as house was published in a number of forms, the most well-known being the tree and leaf diagram of 1965. In Place and Occasion, he wrote, "So start with this. Make a welcome of each door and a continence of each window. Make of each place a bunch of places, of each house and each city. For a house is a tiny city and a city a huge house," end quote. This is almost identical to Alberti's statement, but when one examines Van Eyck's further commentary, we understand that he meant something very different. For example, Van Eyck's rebuttal to Christopher Alexander's 1966 article, "The City is Not a Tree," challenged the part-to-whole hierarchy of Alexander's semi-lattice theory as overly systematic, oversimplified, and ultimately, the ultimate put-down, unpoetic. Van Eyck is suspicious of any system that suggests a structured or formal autonomy divorced from how humans interact with each other and the built environment, and from the human condition itself. In a presentation and following discussion that prompted his challenge to Alexander, Van Eyck simply argues that house and city are both a bunch of places for human beings, with all of the complexity and ambiguity that comes with human existence. He states, "To proceed from the idea of dwelling in a sense of living in a house in order to arrive at the idea of living in a sense of living in a city implies simultaneously that you proceed from the idea of living in the sense of dwelling in a city in order to arrive at the idea of dwelling in the sense of living in a house." A talk by Van Eyck in 1963 is perhaps clearest in articulating his humanist position when he states, "The job of the planner is to provide built homecoming for all, to sustain a feeling of belonging. I would go so far to say that architecture is built homecoming." What I think Van Eyck means is that the same fundamental needs satisfied by home can also be incorporated into the considerations of the city. To illustrate, I'm just going to briefly turn to the classical Greek city, where the Prytaneum and the Bouleuterium were paired with the city's sacred hearth. Hestia was the virgin goddess of the house and the hearth, and worshipped daily in Greek homes. But Hestia also had a civic role as the guardian of the sacred hearth of Greek cities, and was closely associated with the Prytaneum. And so her personified divinity and responsibilities range from the individual dwelling to the civic center, both essential to the preservation of well-being. Furthermore, Hestia was typically paired with Hermes, who personified communication, mobility, oneness. His statues mark Greek roads and the thresholds to homes. Hestia, internal, dark, stable, and Hermes, external, light, dynamic, established the Prytaneum as both a center and a threshold. It not only held the sacred fire, but was also a repository of artifacts significant to the city's history. In Norman Crow's words, as a community's counterpart to the family hearth, the hearth of the polis reinforced the unity between citizen, the family, and the community. Now, of course, the city house-city analogy as a theoretical construct is problematic in that it risks oversimplifying a complex subject, although Van Eyck's colleague Hermann Hertzberger had little patience for it. declaiming that von Eyck's theory was too limited, too narrow, and that he would prefer to forget the city as a house. Of course, he's right. Analogies in and of themselves do not explicate and are only useful if they serve to disclose broader areas of related inquiry. In the context of this paper, I'm interested in positioning urbanism within a particular history of architecture, its roles in articulating the world and our place within it. As I've often argued, from the earliest of works, the media of architecture has served as an intermediary between humans and the gods they worshipped or the knowledge they sought. Examples from the history of sacred architecture can be comparatively understood as serving to replicate and explicate a world that otherwise, it was believed, would have remained hidden. They are both heroic and heartbreaking in their expressions of the perennial human quest for understanding and for meaning. Hermann Hertzberger writes about the special capacity of art, and by extension architecture, to change our understanding of a particular place and our relationship to it. Quoting, "Not only do painters succeed in rendering the space of our reality, the opposite is also true, that reality is a rendering of the painter's space. We also experience space as we know it from the images given to painters," end quote. What does he mean by this? Isn't it about the transformative potential of art to change the ways in which we see the world? The German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer insisted that we do not encounter the work of art without being transformed in the process. He meant that creative artifacts have an enduring capacity to engage and even positively change us. Art and design can be a means to articulate and provide new perspectives to life's most important questions. Some argued that the embodied and experiential capacities of architecture in the built environment can affect us in ways that are instructive, even life-changing. Louis Kahn poetically suggested that the city is a place where a boy might discover what he wants to be for the rest of his life. Assessing what architecture does is a fruitful enterprise, but problematic, however, due to its largely subjective nature. Perhaps more reliable, what do we ask architecture and the built environment to do? Not what it does, what do we ask it to do? And as it turns out, throughout history, we've asked architecture to do quite a lot. As a predominant cultural artifact, architecture has often been tasked with embodying and articulating what a culture values most. The material evidence of the history of architecture is both a mirror and a lamp, both reflecting and illuminating the culture that produced it. That said, architecture per se doesn't actually mean anything at all. We assign meaning to it as part of the roles we ask it to play. In these contexts, we can conceptualize architecture as an active agent, engaging its users in a variety of perceptual, visual, and experiential ways. We come to understand architecture and construct its meaning through our daily and episodic, individual and collective engagements with it. We have often asked architecture in the built environment to replicate or reveal the world and situate our place within it. Acts of building, of making a home or a city in an inherently unstable world have served to connect us with ourselves and our place in the cosmos, while simultaneously revealing the vast context of which we are a part. This double mediation, individual to architecture, architecture to the world, speak of the essential roles that architecture has been asked to play generally and has often materialized specifically. However, the capacity of architecture and urbanism to articulate the human condition and render it more comprehensible and meaningful is limited at best. I don't give architecture and urbanism any special providence to help humans explicate the world and facilitate our homecoming. It does so problematically and inadequately. But similar to Winston Churchill's statement that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. It is perhaps one of the better means we have, perhaps even our best hope. In particular, cities may have the most promise of materializing the collective aspects of the human condition and of transcending the depressing and erroneous concept of separate individuality. But in recognition of the limits of human understanding, we should not ask the built environment to do more than it has the capacity to do. Otherwise, notions, assignments, and aspirations can become overly ideological or instrumental, proscriptive and prescriptive means to achieve goals dislocated from the larger tasks of the built environment and its capacity and limitations to materialize them. It is somewhere in between these multiple considerations of the city as a home and the diverse meanings it embodies that some useful understandings and positions may emerge, while recognizing that the communicative and ontological roles of the built environment are multifarious and widely interpretable. As Harries reminds us, quoting, "Meanings cannot finally be made or invented. They must be discovered." Now, this talk does not include the following, but the paper will, due to time constraints. I had to leave that out. But it also, the paper itself includes considerations of contemporary urban theories. I wanted to make those connections, namely new urbanism, post-urbanism, and everyday urbanism, as they have been known, as a means interrogating whether they are positioned in ways congruent with the themes I have outlined. It also discusses personages and programs that address issues of well-being and spirituality, with particular attention to the relationship between urbanism and a sustainable future, as well as the collective anxiety around global climate change. It also argues that while it is appropriate to talk about spiritually uplifting places, we need and benefit from them. If our postulations are disconnected from the broad spectrum of human life, which includes social and economic disparity and the need for equitable housing, education, transportation, and services, they risk becoming a certain type of aloof elitism. And lastly, within the complex, confusing, and often conflicting issues and imperatives of the future city, these sections suggest that the multiple ontological considerations of urbanism may fruitfully include reading the city, both textually and phenomenologically, as a means of analysis, recognizing its historical continuities, both positive and negative, confronting contemporary imperatives, especially the relationship between settlement patterns and global change, formulating progressive future directions, and lastly, and for me most importantly, the value of establishing how each of us might find our little contribution to our collective efforts. A few concluding remarks. In a scene from Woody Allen's film Midnight in Paris, where themes of ontological anxiety permeate and the city is positioned as redemptive, the lead character wonders, quoting here, how is anybody ever going to come up with a book or a painting or a symphony or a sculpture that can compete with a great city? You can't, because if you look around, every street, every boulevard has its own special art form. And he goes on to ponder, quoting, in a cold, violent, mean universe that Paris exists, and that, quoting, way out in space, you can see these lights, the cafes, people singing. For all we know, Paris is the hottest spot in the universe. Positioning the city as a meaningful home on a planet that is our only home. After all, as Cicero alludes, the built environment is an intrinsic part of the larger environment. They're all environments, of which we are an integrated part. Pascal reflected, quoting, "Returning to himself, let man consider what he is compared with all existence. Let him think of himself as lost in this remote corner of nature, and from this little dungeon in which he finds himself lodged, I mean the universe, let him learn to set a true value on the earth, its realms, its cities, its houses, and himself in their proper value." End quote. For Heidegger, true homecoming is through an understanding of our essential homelessness, our being in the world, and our place in finite and infinite space and time. This was, or perhaps is, his call for an authentic life, and perhaps one that offers perspectives on the future city as a place not only of commerce, ease, and entertainment, of all the myriad of things it does, expresses, and provides, but one that also assists in an authentic and continuous homecoming to our shared humanity. Thank you.
Our last speaker for this afternoon is Nader Ardalan. Nader is a practicing architect and author with over 5 decades of award-winning international experience in the field of environmentally sustainable and culturally relevant design. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Yale, and MIT. He's a founding member of the steering committee of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and a member of the executive committee of the International Forum of Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality. He's currently Senior Research Associate at Harvard University Graduate School of Design and Senior Editor for the Gulf Sustainable Urbanism Research Project. His paper today is entitled Inspirations from a Long Lost Letter.
Hello. It's always wonderful to be the last person to speak because there's so much anticipation. There'll be nothing really profound said here. I have been asking for these many years that Ahmad has been good enough to refer to, what does architecture want to be? And I found, after some 40 years, a long-lost letter that my daughter found and sent to me just a few weeks ago as I was pondering what to say here. After all these wonderful presentations that have been made, commencing really from Thursday, Friday, and today. So I thought that I would share with you really my search as a student of architecture and where it has led me to today through practical working on it. And if I've done any research and any writing, it has been only due to inform me about meaningful things to build. This letter was written by Louis Kahn in support of The Sense of Unity, which is the book that was published in 1973. And I bring out of it just a few highlights because really he guided me to these. And I want to share with you his words because it is those directions of thought that he shared that I believe might be instrumental even in this area that we're trying to follow. So what he said first about the book, which is sort of self-promoting, is what they are bringing to us is the recalling of the original inspiration which motivated building. This is really what Lou was always after. He was after the origins of architecture. This is so, and this is now what I think is his thought. This is so important now when the means sought to express directions to our human environment building is in great part professionally based upon statistics, surveys, and technology. So here, 1972, he's really saying the very case in which we exist today. We build from these statistics, these quantifiable things, and he then went on to say that times long ago had only meager means to go on. They were highly motivated by wonder, this awe, which brought about the desire to learn, the profundity of which lay at the threshold of where the unmeasurable and the measurable met. This meeting was the moment of inspiration when the desire to express met the possible. Today as yesterday, such moments are essential to man. So here's then the actual quote that we used the other day of what he thought architecture wanted to be. A great building must, in my opinion, begin with the unmeasurable and go through the measurable in the process of design, but must in the end be unmeasurable. And so he followed this path, and I want to just share a few images to get us into this mood. And here he was commissioned by Johannes Salk to do the Salk Center in San Diego, in La Jolla. And Salk only asked him one thing. He said, I want this to be a place that I could invite Picasso to visit. So therefore, Lou said to himself, I must activate the poetic artist in me. And I want to show you the space which you saw before, but look at this central court as it evolves at that spiral little line of water shining to the desert, to the setting sun, to the rising moon. And it's interesting because I want to tell a story. Before this design was actually completed, he invited a wonderful friend, Luis Barragan, the great Mexican architect. And at that time, Lou was considering to plant the garden with trees. And Luis Barragan said to him, consider the silence of this space. Plant nothing. Leave it essentially as nothingness. Lou, of course, poetically, artistically, naughty as he was, put that stream of water. And I share with you something about Luis Barragan and this silence. I'm doing this because I'm interested in now speaking about a generation of architects that inculcated a certain vision about what architecture should be. And in that period, Vincent Scully, the wonderful artist, architectural critic at Yale, said about the group at that time in history, very important time in history, perhaps the 20th century sort of culmination of what we've been speaking about, spirituality and architecture and urbanism and well-being. They, meaning this group of architects, effectively bring the international style to a close and open the way to a much solider modernism, one in which the revival of the vernacular and classical traditions of architecture and the corollary mass movement for historic preservation would eventually come to play a central role. Scully continued, he, Kahn, seems to have been at the beginning of some new integration in his work when he died March 17, 1974. What he would have made to heal the wounds that the modern age has inflicted on our cities is perhaps not hard to tell. I want to say that this international style created in the 1914, after the 1917 end of the World War I, brought about the modern architecture. It brought into being an attitude that if this European civilization that brought this world war and this horror of millions and millions of deaths, I want to have nothing to do with it. We wish to create a tabula rasa and to begin anew. And in that beginning anew, culture, history, even the environment seemed for them to be an impediment to an abstract international style that came into being. And particularly, it was named international style as such in the 1940s by Philip Johnson and others. And in many ways, it is this world that Liu Kahn and those such as Barragan and others, and I'll speak more about others who have also commented on this, that somehow we have inherited. But yet these people dared to challenge that and brought about a solid spirituality. And we spoke this morning about the materiality of buildings. What are the buildings that give you the sense of quietness and repose, rather than buildings of action and anxiety? I want to now just talk a bit about these 40-some years of research and building and talk about some lessons learned. These, I must say to you, are really my personal contributions, although they have been done in many ways with a lot of students and at a lot of international situations and universities. First, about worldview, there is a cosmogonic thinking that is very important. That is, the epistemology of creation beliefs speak to deeply meaningful questions held by the society that share them, revealing of their central worldview and the framework for the self-identity of the culture and individual in a universal context. That is, we must be conscious of worldviews. And then your structure of being within that creative idea. The cosmogonic man tends towards a mode of comprehension which provides both a metaphysical and phenomenal interpretation of life based upon an ontological consciousness of ultimate reality and an inseparable link with nature. The two, the metaphysical and the phenomenal. With regards to space-time, orientation in space, it is only with reference to the heavens, the rising and setting sun and moon, the rotation of stars and the prevailing breezes, that the infiniteness of space can be quantifiably and qualitatively grasped. The sense of place. When order in cosmic space is achieved, the interpretive mind seeks regional order. Here, sustainable adaptation to environmental context, the impact of memorable natural settings, distant mountain peaks, ocean views, river valleys, unique landscapes, the genius loci and geomancy of a place inspires and motivates the primary setting out of the urban form, its density, texture, typology of forms, and its pivotal visual axes. Ancient origins. Somehow, the more ancient the origins of a city's founding date, the more imbued are these urban places with a cosmic consciousness of their primordial and timeless beginnings. Shape and surface, quality in architecture. Architecture, the process of creating archetypes. Greek, architecture, archi, origins, archetype, tekti, tak, carpenter, building, process, the process of building archetypes. Where is that in the work that we're doing? Where is the archetype, our quest, when architecture seeks that to be its essence? Transcendent symbolism. Man has the propensity for symbolic thinking and expression. Symbols transform man and carry timeless archetypal signs. Where are our signs? Have we identified the signs of our times? Oh, you're joking. Ritual. Sacred path, places, and religion and pilgrimage, places of knowledge. Sacred places all shelter one or more sacred sites, shrines, or religious places of pilgrimage. multicultural integrated communities, significant political economic vitality, the quality of openness to multiculturalism, where people of different faiths and ethnicity can commingle, is another characteristic of a numinous place, cosmopolitan spirituality. Urban space, the public realm, paradise gardens, pedestrian and human scale. The positive and vital concept of space generates many of the memorable places. These public spaces have a spiritual dimension, and the active participation of the community helps in creating, enhancing, and maintaining them. I'm going to show you some of my work, too. I have, I guess, over the last 30 years, evolved as an American-trained architect, 18 years in New York, Washington, San Francisco, Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, etc. I was taught in the 1950s and 60s that this is the essence of architecture. Form follows function, and technology allows you to build that function. This is what we inherited in the modern movement, and I had the pleasure of being taught by Mies, by Albers, and these, so this is our genealogy, many of us. And really then later on, when I moved back to Iran, and I tried to find who am I, as the Japanese Izutsu who taught me said, Nadir, what is your original face? I certainly knew that I had to know something about my culture. And so I began to write The Sense of Unity. And then in time, I had the great pleasure of 5 years working with Ian McCard, the great regional ecological planner, who really taught me about environment and environmental adaptation. Though these principles motivated then much of my work. I want to show you two works, one unbuilt, one built. Toward the end of the 1970s, the United States, in its good grace and friendship with the great country of Iran, negotiated 4 nuclear plants to be built in Iran. And one of these plants was to be built in the beautiful city of Isfahan, in the outskirts of Isfahan. And I had the great pleasure of being the architect of this city of 100,000 people. But then the client, who had been my client when we did the work with Ian McCard, he said, Nadir, I want you to build me a solar city. And so the client motivated what had already been very much geared in me to build Nuran, a city of light, the city of illumination in Isfahan. And I just quickly say something about Isfahan. Isfahan, Sasanian origins, pre-Islamic period. In fact, in these areas, the great fire temple had been. And then, interesting enough, that great fire temple also is the place of the Masjid al-Jami, 10th, 12th century Seljuk. So the sacred place remains. It's just that instead of the Chartaq in which the fire built, the Chartaq, the 4 quarters, still remains, but the fire moves and becomes the mihrab and the direction of Mecca and prayer. And so the city grew, and we drew these through our research of this wonderful, wonderful series of gardens and positive spaces that really developed over 600 years. And so the idea of linear, positive space and order in the universe in this city. But the site of this site is just up there between those mountains, and this is Isfahan. And of course, there is a site, and this is that great Maidan-e-Shah, or Maidan-e-Naqsh-e-Jahan in Iran. And if you aligned the 2 hillocks within that encapsulated mountain and drew it down, my God, it hit exactly on the very center of the spiritual side, because it's in the east, of the great Maidan. And so that became the spiritual axis of the city. And that axis came right onto the little beautiful Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque. It really gave meaning to the line. And then when we went out to the site, and the site is still there, hot, dry, dusty. So the team obviously took with them watermelons. And we burst open the watermelons, got into them, and we said to ourselves, well, we have the answer. Hot and dry, cold and wet. Do a cold and wet design. So the master plan of the city was a cold and wet design, all based on the solar movement, the idea from high to low, natural irrigation, etc. And it had really two heads. This, the head closest to Esfahan, was a commercial material head. This, on the hillock, was the intellectual head. And between the two lay the lowest land, where the waters would naturally gravitate, and the waters would create these avenues, and it would create a great linear garden. And there you would place the residue of the knowledge between the question and the answer in the museums. That what is life about? What is the history about? And et cetera, et cetera. So this became the basis of our work. And of course, we did courtyard housing after a lot of studies about what the city was about. Many, many techniques of solar ponds, solar collectors. And finally, in the setting sun, the axis of the green garden spine would be known. Never built. Revolution occurred, price stopped. However, this one was built. Harvard Business School. We both graduated with Habib Lajivardi, he business school, me GST. And when we went to Iran, he said, Nader, I'd like to do something more than just selling soap. And I said, I'd like to build something more than what I've learned to do, and I've written this book, I want to practice. He said, good. So I drew the Garden of Fien and designed the Harvard Business School around this wonderful garden that lies in Kashan, near to Tehran, south of Tehran. And it was a great garden, filled with fruit trees, quince, pomegranate, apples, pears, and on the side lay the case study rooms, courtyards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 in each, eight study unit, which is the business school module. At the center of that courtyard, a wonderful magnolia. And then at the center, the library, and the place case studies and the administration. And that really is the Fien in what it exists. And again, studying the sun, etc., the units. And we built a module, all very modular, so that we didn't have enough money to build everything, but we had left the module into which, in time, these all clicked geometrically and became the final form. And this is what was realized. In brick, natural garden, in shadows, with all these students, and really they became the place of the highest level of business and government officials who were trained there for about 7 or 8 years, with about 7 or 8 Harvard professors. So just quickly to go through the ideas. Very much concerned with using traditional materials. So we investigated the brick technology, which by that time had become passé. We had to do things in glass and others, but here was this. And we actually had, very rigorous mid-career gentlemen living, and women in separate compartments here, but mingling in the common meeting room. And these were the sort of spaces and feelings. And all of it was gravity naturally irrigated. And in the doorway we had wonderful carvings, and then the flow of water. This was a part of the aesthetic at the time of Lucan's talking about these. I got it? Well, what happened? This is what happened. Globalization happened. Just look at the transformation of the world from this Zurich TJF analysis of the globalization of the world. That is, the integration of the world, particularly through telecommunications and then internet weave. So we became knit digitally. And as we became knit digitally, we are now here, we're at Harvard, we're doing this golf research project, really the only reason we have written it that way. Compromise between Persian Gulf negotiated versus Arab Gulf, and so that is where it lies. But its historic name is Persian Gulf. And in these cities, we were interested in studying how did they survive in this highest radiant gain and in a condition of extreme lack of water. Well, they were adaptive. They existed. And we studied this from social, cultural, economic, environmental, public health, etc., with Jack and others. And so we just finished that work. And what we've documented is that now when you see those little white dots are 600 oil wells, that with this new wealth, everything changed. This whole place became part of the international business machine. So this is Sheikh Khalifa Tower, tallest building in the world. And when this was done, then some people, naughty people, began to say things like this. There are no rules, only a feeling of wonderful freedom. Ideally, we would, now this is what is being said for the Venice Biennale by one of the leading components and proponents of the so-called neo-international style modern movement. Ideally, we would want the essential countries in this exhibition to engage in a single theme, absorbing modernity, 1914-2014, and to show each in their own way the process of the erasure of national characteristics in favor of the almost universal adoption of a single modern language and a single repertoire topology. Business talking. Business talking. And we then, of course, said nothing doing. Are these proposals valid and relevant for the cultures of the Gulf region? They seem to represent old and outdated international style credo of the 40s, that good design can exist without consideration of placemaking, environment, culture, history, religion, and that the architect has license to design anything that comes to mind. And of course, this is not possible. The premise challenges that this is a very complex issue. Adaptation to environment, context, cultural relevance, and the heritage of the social identity are so intertwined with the quality of spatial, cosmogonic experience and holistic, sustainable design that you cannot do these things. Now, I'm finished in 3 minutes. Now, my friends who were with us until 10 p.m. last night have given this wonderful chuckle because everybody participated after we had finished our conference, and the others who were not there will say, what is this? Okay, I just want to simply say, we said, let's all get together and for 2 hours, let's brainstorm, because we got people from Siberia, we got people from India, we got people from this place and that. It's a pretty good gathering of an international representation of really top-notch architects and practitioners and teachers. We said, what is list of the transcendent architects and landscape architects you can think of? And so the group came up with these relatively democratically, and it's a working list, and they all signed, so that it's a more or less. So I just want to say, I don't see Rem Koolhaas's name on this list. So I'm going to end with this one. You're going to see cosmic microwave image 370,000 years after the Big Bang. Wow, is that possible? Max Planck Institute said it is just this March. So there is this image, heat image, of the Big Bang moving out into space as what particles of different densities before they coalesced and became singularities, such as the sun or the earth and its flare and the earth and the aurora borealis as it affects us. So why do I show this? And I'm ending. I'm ending now because we have to contrast this scientific knowledge, this context of our place in space, and what Lou said. Traditions are just mounds of golden dust, not circumstance, not the shapes which have resulted as an expression in time. And if you can just put your fingers through this golden dust, you can have the powers of anticipation. So timelessness, and yet time, at the level of knowledge that we are. And so there, last slide. You have obviously a new cosmogonic paradigm. NASA says cosmology seeks the what of the universe, cosmogony seeks the why of the universe. We're interested in the both of them. And Paul Wheatley says, you know, this stuff, but really what those ancient people who designed Isfahan and the great cities in the world that we admire, they were products of a cosmo-magical thinking, of a cosmic consciousness of our being. And then Erik Erikson says, each individual must learn how to hold both extremes, each specific life stage. He talks of life, the 8 life stages, but these two things are the timeless and the time, the cosmic and the material, the measurable and the unmeasurable. So I end with, were it not for the hope of the fruit, would the gardener have planted this tree? Thank you.
So our speakers, could you please? So first I would like to give a chance to our speakers if they have comments or questions to each other before we open the floor. Or if you prefer to start with questions from the audience first.
Yeah.
Okay, so questions?
It's been such an incredible couple of days. It's been such an incredible couple of days. I need to speak louder?
No, you're fine.
Oh, thank you.
That's perfect now.
That's perfect.
Don't move.
You know how to disarm me, Tom. I'm overwhelmed. Certainly by this morning and the continuation this afternoon. The incredible loftiness of the thoughts beyond my capacity was inspiring. However, I thought, listening to Mr. Warabotu, Simi Warabotu, that he was bringing us back down to earth in a way, even though he was talking about something much greater than earth. And I wanted to remind Tom, perhaps, that there were other sides to Oliver Van Eyck and to Christopher Alexander. I once drove in a battered old station wagon up the coast of California with 2 young colleagues to look at the Orthodox church left by the Russian otter traders in 1828. And as we got there, Aldo Van Eyck, who was one of them, and Denise Scott Brown was the other, he jumped out of the car and said, "Is that the Pacific?" And he ran down and he pulled out a 20-foot long piece of seaweed. And he ran delightedly like a child up the beach and said, "Put that in the back of the wagon." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "This is the Pacific. I want to dip this in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean and every ocean in the world as I travel. I want to say hello to the Pacific and hello to the Red Sea from the Pacific." This was another side of Aldo, the small side of him, the great small side of him. Chris Alexander, if ever you got in the back of his house and sat in his garden with him, there was a little pond and a couple of plants around. And you'd ask, "Why are we sitting here, Chris?" And he'd say, "This is where I experience what some call the divine." A tiny pond. And that made me think of a great geologist. I was glad that the geologist intervened this morning in the back row. There's a great geologist called Brian Bailey. He has written a book a couple of years ago called Our Joyful Minds, which brings everybody down to the joy of living with science. He has visited as a young man both poles, Arctic and Antarctic. There are 2 glaciers named after him, Brian Bailey. I asked him once, what got you into such a level where you were dealing with such an immensity in geology? He said, there was a rock in the bottom of my auntie's garden. And he said, I learned a great deal from this rock when I was a boy. And all of a sudden I realized, here's a man who started as Alan did this morning when he suggested there's awe in looking at a ladybug. And when I wanted to ask Alan about gardening, he answered it later, I thought of E.F. Schumacher, who said small is beautiful. I started my career in architecture designing an Olympic stadium for 100,000 people, taking over a beautiful park. I ended my career, maybe it's not ended yet, but a short while ago, with an addition to a small student religious center, an interdenominational center, an addition that is approximately the size and shape of this curve here, in which you sit. So, and I've told Harvey Cox, in answer to his great challenge the other day, and this brings me back to Mr. Waributu, when Harvey said it's up to you architects now to redesign those cities, to design those cities almost eschatological cities, Eucharistic cities, and thanks to heaven. I said to him, there's such a wave among young architects of interventions at small scale. And you suggested that there be many charismatic, small-scale improvisations. I would like to reinforce that.
We will take a couple more questions, and then, just in the interest of time, we'll take 2 more questions, and then the speakers will have a chance to respond.
I've recently come across, I've recently come across writings of Ibn Arabi's notion of the barzakh in terms of what I see as liminal landscapes. And this said something to me in terms of what you were saying, where the ineffable meets the nameable as a sacred place. And I would like to hear more about that.
I have a couple comments, questions. One for Nimi. One is what is the role of beauty in this rising emotion? I didn't see your conversation on beauty. Maybe I missed it. Maybe you want to talk about beauty and the charismatic city work. And then to Tom, homelessness is also, I think you begin to mention that, but it's also a way towards the divine. And in Buddhist tradition, the enlightenment is about homelessness, it's not home. So, and also, if you look at the Christian tradition, this earth living is really in between what's happening next, which is the ultimate meaning of our existence, is the eternal. So the sense of home here, from a pure Christian tradition, and I may be wrong here, it may be transitional rather than home in the sense of stability and the classical understanding of home. So maybe you want to comment on that.
We can have some answers, and then...
Sure. Well, you ended up with me, so I'll turn it over to you. I mean, there's only so much that you can include in a paper, and in the Japanese, particularly medieval Japanese poetry and prose, there's some wonderful pieces about homelessness and in the value of a kind of essential living. Basho, of course, that was the eternal wanderer, but there were other writers. There's one 12th century writer who talked about his 10-square hut and how in this very simple abode, right, that was, would just blow away as dust, right? That was where the divine was found. It's actually paradoxically in the homeless you find a home. And Buddhism is very specific about that. From notions of the lack of an endurance of a separate self, which is a particularly difficult concept, to a kind of relentless examination of our presumptions, which is something I think you can tell I'm very interested in doing. Impermanence. Nothing remains the same.
Can I say that? On the subject? Rumi said, "Hear the song of the reed forlorn, since it was torn from the rushing reed bed where it was born."
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes. I talked about in the charismaticity in the sense that the idea of encountering God or beauty or the divine is no longer tied to only big projects that overwhelms you, but in different little ways, then you encounter that, and cities could be designed in a way to promote that. So it's improvisation, but it doesn't completely do away with rationalization, because we cannot completely ignore the era of modernity, what we've learned, but making it so that there is no more one central place. Unlike the era of the ancient time, the sacred city was the place to go. People have pilgrimages to those places, but they may still be there. We don't completely escape that, but we open up different places that within the city itself becomes a place to view the city as a place where we encounter God. Even in New York City, sometimes if I'm driving from New Jersey and I come to the place where I look at New York City, it's very calming, very great sense of beauty. Or at the Penn State, the station at Philadelphia, the train station, there's a beautiful artwork. And so things could be done. So to your question about the role of beauty, yes, in encountering God or the divine or spiritual, beauty will play a part. And in the ancient times, they understood that good paintings, good carvings, or the way things are done. So my thing about the charismatic city is that how do we design the city so that every aspect of it, this is part of the utopia, every aspect of it is emotionally charged. It encourages that confrontation with something beautiful. I don't always have to go into a museum, that I could begin to experience beauty and the divine. So what I'm saying is that if we believe in the idea that the presence of God has been dispersed out of a special place, we must be very careful that we're not designing the future city in a way that there must be a place where we encounter God. But how do we make every part of the city to be that important that people can encounter this all? They can get a sense of oneness and communion. And this is what essentially was said in the morning, the first panel of speakers. How do we do that? And beauty will be part of that design. Beauty even in the way we do the building, the trees, and even the way the layout of the city itself. So all those will contribute to the idea of the beauty. And then, so the city itself becomes a work of art that enables us as a media to encounter the divine, or to enrich our spiritual well-being.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more from Nimi Wariboko, because in the introduction of you, Nimi, they did not mention something that I know about you, which is that you are a Pentecostal pastor of a charismatic church in one of the fastest growing Pentecostal denominations in the world, in a branch of Christianity which is itself the fastest growing in the world, over 500 million people. And I want to ask you about something that is characteristic of Pentecostal worship that puzzles many, many people. And that is the phenomenon of so-called speaking in tongues, of glossolalia, and of what appear to be different kind of trance states, being slain in the Lord or being carried into a kind of ecstatic experience. We've heard a lot about contemplation here and the more kind of quiet ways of meditating. Yet there was a book a few years ago called, on Pentecostals called Main Street Mystics, suggesting that maybe this is the kind of poor man's mysticism we're talking about here. You don't have to go to a temple or even sit cross-legged. You walk in, and it's the possibility of an alternative state is there for anyone who wants to experience it. I wonder if you've thought a little about that, especially listening this morning to this talk about the spiritual and health benefits of these contemplative states. If there are ways that we haven't quite registered yet that aren't as demanding, let's say, of the long disciplinary rigor of most of the Asiatic methods of meditation, contemplation.
Okay. Yes, and that is why in my introduction I said this talk about urban design, or which scientists have not taken into account the emergence of the Pentecostal movement. For any movement in the last 100 years that have gathered 500 million people, it's a good chunk of them, and it's still growing. And the beauty of that in most places is that it combines both some form of ancient primordial spirituality with a little bit of modernity and going to the future. And I said it has this sense of it captures the time. Like Pentecostalism is the archetype of religion, because if you don't have to be a Christian, but if you understand this core of charismatics, this core of spirituality, this core of encounter with the God that is freed up, no class, no place or so, it's in most places it's in many other religions, right? And therefore, if you have to design a city for the future, we also have to understand that, because the idea of contemplation, sitting down, so it might be good, but there are many 500 million people who don't do that, and that number is growing. And there are also people who are indigenous forms of religion who don't do all that. So how do you have a more democratic flow of the spirit, a more democratic flow of the spiritual energy that people can encounter, that is not limited to nationality, is trans-territorial. And Pentecostalism is very trans-territorial. So how do you take it as an archetype of our time, of the form of spirituality that is going on, and then think about it then to the design, as Nada has said, what is the archetype? Because is our architecture going to also reflect the archetype of our religion? We are no more in that Protestant era, nationalism, control, quiet form of religion. At least that is not what the bulk of the world is going, what Pentecostalism. So how does your architect also reflect that sense of spirit? And what I'm saying is not particular to Pentecostalism. You can find it in Hinduism. It's coming up in Islam. This idea of spirituality that is more ecstatic, not Apollyon spirituality, and that is coming up in many religions. And so, if we are architect is supposed to capture the archetype of our time, and I'm saying that we may need to understand the nature of Pentecostalism, not because you have to be Pentecostal, but to understand what is it that makes it attractive, and what does that say about the times that we live in. And that's why I wrote a book called The Pentecostal Principle, just to say, what is it about the principle? And I said the principle is not limited to Pentecostalism or Christianity, but what is it that is at this core, this openness, this unfinishedness of life, and this thing to encounter the divine in anywhere. And that's why I call it the Pentecostal principle. And how could that principle influence the way we design cities also?
May I
Yes.
comment? Wonderful. Thank you, Harvey, for activating this. Really, then, it is equally as much to do with our attitude and how we approach the world as it is to the built objects and signs. Because if you don't have it within yourself, and you don't, first of all, you have all the signs within yourself. It's the activation within the individual of all that exists. But we're more or less in slumber, as they say, to our inner selves. And so you could build the most beautiful thing outside, And if you haven't awakened this activity, this quality, then you will not recognize it. It will do no good. So I want to say, and some way to go back to a number of things you've said and a question. In the 13th century, where Ibn Arabi lived in Spain, and Maimonides lived, and others, we had a culmination of a very high period of consciousness. It has to do with this beautiful thing, consciousness. So Ibn Arabi, really, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, had a great conception, which is very much relevant to all the things that we're talking about today. It's called Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of existence, the totality of existence. That is, we're all part of some great totality. But at the same time, what I worry about in some of the discussions we've had in the last few days, and partly today, is to create too much sacred objectification of the objects outside ourselves. And, you know, for instance, again, I'm really trying to be as ecumenical and holistic, so what I say is only from the more research I've done about one particular path of faith. The Islamic faith views and has the 99 names of the divine. These are really 99 archetypes. So let's take one of them, like the compassionate. Well, that's in you. If you are a compassionate person, you're doing an act of the divine. You know, this is your own activation. So I think that this is where Julio's talk this morning complemented in many ways, although he didn't emphasize that in a half hour. I think you spoke on it in a very small point. It's the inside, the inner person has to have this approach, or else it's meaningless. It will not be appreciated. So there is, how do we transform ourselves to be more alert and conscious of the totality of existence is as important as the institutions we bring into being, the buildings we make, the architecture, because all of this we will be blind to. It will mean nothing to us, and we'll still go on the plodding way that we have, plundering the earth.
Question for Tom. I was thinking about some of the early writings on the culture of cities of the late 19th and early 20th century, which picked on the fact that the city was cosmopolitan and therefore it was also complex, and it provided anonymity, and that anonymity provided a freedom that was not possible elsewhere, because in the village you're always under the gaze of tradition and your behavior is constrained. So someone like George Simmel writes about a new breed of urban monk who has the freedom to withdraw into himself and reflect in a way that he could not outside the city. Or Robert Park comes up with this wonderful formulation that the role of the city is to foreground the moral range of deviant behavior. So in that context, perhaps the metaphor of house as city and city as house becomes problematic, because the house exists at the level of architecture where the primary impulse is the construction of order, and the city is also about the vitality and potential in disorder.
We'll have two more questions before.
I'm glad you're taking that.
Okay.
Just say I'm going to defer to my senior colleague.
I just wanted to, kind of in this mode here, I could talk in a variety of different ways, but I'm going to talk again in the evangelical tradition. It's the place that I stand. So, in terms of home, connecting to your talk, Tom, to go back to the Genesis story, the home, as described in the Bible, in Genesis, is that God, remember, created a garden. God actually created it. And the narrative says, and then he took out of the dirt to his mouth, her mouth, and he breathes. So it's a very close, we were created out of the dirt. And it's the very, and so pretty much as God as a gardener. Our very first image of God is she is a gardener, right? And he welcomed, or she welcomed us into a garden that is the home that we have. So our place, and the narrative goes on, obviously, but I think what we get from that is that Earth is our home. God makes a place for us, welcomes us into relationship with God. And I think that has some implications as we think through design and architecture, connecting home to garden. Garden home is being very close, so city and rural, city and farm need to go together. And I would like to keep that together. If that makes sense. One more question?
Thank you. Thank you to all panelists for a very inspiring talk. And first, a question to Tom, and then one to all the panel. It seemed to me, Tom, as you wove your beautiful tapestry, as you always do, that the articulation of home as city and city as home was really centered around a personal quest. I mean, not your personal quest, but an individual quest in society. Yet you ended with the idea of homecoming to common humanity. So I'm curious to see how you see that connection between the individual to the multiplicity of individuals in a diverse home that is the city. So the idea of diversity. And then extending to the whole panel, we saw from this morning that there's a possibility of a universal sacredness, or perhaps a universally appealing and awe-inspiring presence in nature. How might this translate into architecture that is necessarily, culturally defined and perhaps culturally specific, either in the charismatic city or in the individual architectural constructions that we conceive of? How might we think of universally sacred space, if such a thing is possible? And might such a place be a source of friendship, where friendship is built, again, across diversity and across different cultures, different religions, and perhaps as we reflect and be in awe of the Creator, might we also fall into a sense of awe of each other? Thank you.
Well, we have a number of questions on the floor.
I would take the second question.
Oh, so you don't want the first one? Huh?
No. That was to you.
Prem, you're absolutely right. It's a problematic construct. I fully admit that. And, my choice in framing my discussion in that manner is simply a choice. I'm not trying to be relativistic here, but a way to kind of navigate a slice through considerations of architecture and urbanism, and mostly, focused on this, you might say, belief of the capacity of all of us to, as we engage in an everyday way. That's why I so much appreciate your perspective, to find those moments that are transcendent. Right, but not transcendent in the way that, say, I've written about in terms of the kind of state religious architecture, which is, right, in all its complications, but in the everyday. And just a little sidebar, that's why, Margaret Crawford's work with everyday urbanism, on one hand, I say, that's not going to get us anywhere. But on the other hand, I say, well, you're getting me to consider things. You're challenging some of my presumptions here, and helping me to perhaps look at this in a little different way. You know, I'm reminded of the great. No, I have that. Sorry, I'm forgetting. Oh, yeah, Groucho Marx, where he says, "These are my principles, and if you don't like them, I've got others." Right? And I love that because it's like, okay, I really believe this, but do I? Right? And my interest is in really kind of interrogating. This is just one aspect, interrogating the built environment to discover what we ask of it. What are we asking it to do? Lindsay Jones has done beautiful work in this regard that's an inspiration to me in terms of the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? Where you look at all the different perspectives that people bring to particular works of architecture. And that unfolds, for me, how we're all, this is back to now to the, Maged, your question about the individual and collective. You know, how do each of us structure, you know, our particular being in the world? Because there's no one, you know, one way of looking at it. And that's why, you know, with all due respect, I may not agree with Kohlhaas, but I'm not willing to write him off. Because he challenges me, and I think, well, sure, maybe I should consider that, you know, and take a look at that a little bit more. So in the end, you know, this notion of the city as emancipatory, of course, is part of those writings, and I certainly agree with that. And you know, for me, it's, you know, getting to the individual, what. You know, the other aspect of what I'm very interested in are those individual engagements. That's why I work in affordable housing. And you think about it, what could be more disorienting, more, you know, challenging to develop a spiritual life than being homeless or living in substandard or dangerous housing? It's kind of an essential thing. And that keeps me grounded.
Let me take off right where you are, Tom, with your permission.
Yeah, sure.
I really believe it is in the simple things. Your question was, how do you get involved with this sort of universal appeal of sacredness? I think it's very simple. You open the window. Good passive adaptive design in our buildings, in our cities, orientation to north, south, east, west. These are the simple things that we don't do anymore. I believe the fact that you can avoid the 365 days a year of closed boxes that are fully air-conditioned, which certainly our fathers even didn't live in that. Suddenly this is the mode that we must live and use enormous amounts of energy at the despair of the earth. So good adaptive design, and you know, the whole world, like this room, when the weather is good, you open the door, you open the window. You don't have to have the air conditioning. We don't live that way anymore because our mechanical engineers tell us, you're going to throw all the air conditioning balance off by doing that. Well, God, think again, think a little bit better, think a little bit deeper. And so I think it's the simple things that I believe are how you get in touch with nature. Because when we don't open the window, we don't let the air in. When we don't open the shutters and go out to the garden, you don't need a garden. I mean, I think it's the simple acts of adaptation in our environment that will then in very direct ways, without this, you know, oh, the Holy is sacred. No, it's very simple. It's just living simply with nature.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to on the two questions. I think first, from what Tom is doing, I think what we're understanding that it's under something very profound, which is like, do we design cities as the home of men and women? Versus this, like Jim Reeves, this world is not my own, I'm just passing through. And that goes up against the whole idea of the sacred city concept. The sacred city concept that, yes, we may have the temple, we may have here, but really we don't belong here. We belong somewhere else. But then what he's saying is that if we design the city as a home for men and women of the time, means that the world is all what we got. There is no beyond the world. So there is that theological, philosophical concept behind the idea. I think that's one way I'm interpreting what he's doing, that this is his home. Then to the question he asked the old panel, I don't believe that there should be a universal sacred place. Now, I'm not against the idea of universality of sacredness, like you said, where you can meet. But the whole concept in this era of what I call the charismatic city or globalization, or what Hart and Negri call the empire, it means that there is no center. We should rather have a network of sacred places without a center. Because we have to recognize the pluralism of religion, pluralism of views, and therefore we cannot have a universal sacred center. There is no Jerusalem to go or no Mecca to go, no, but we have sacred centers that are in a network, just like what I said, the charismatic city is also a network of cities. But there could be universality of sacred things, that it doesn't depend on the culture you come from, that he is saying that will enable you to encounter God from outside or express God from the inside. But you can't design a way that there must be one universally accepted sacred space, no. But a universality of sacred spaces in a network fashion.
If I can use my authority as standing in here
Yes.
to just comment on the discussion here, I think a very interesting dynamic or question that it seems that everyone in this panel and in the room now is really talking about is this idea, the tension between the universal and the particular, which probably Nader addressed directly in his talk. And I think I want to start from what Nader mentioned about the archetype. And it appears to me that there is an inherent form of oppression in the archetype, and therefore there is an inherent form of oppression in architecture. You're designing a place that I will live in, and I'm not an architect. So there is a form of oppression there, because in a way, you are thinking about how I should live, or how I will live, or how I normally live. And it seems that the tension that we have in this room is that most of the architects here don't like to be oppressors. So you're trying to design something that you think the other would try to live in without being necessarily oppressed. And therefore there is this look for the universal that everyone would accept in one way or another. And Tom, your work on the idea of having a sort of a community design, or a design that comes from the community, which we didn't hear about today, is probably a very interesting discussion, or a very interesting approach in trying to bring the question of architecture to the people who will actually live in this. But then when we go back to the question of universality, I would suggest that probably part of the solution to this, and this is inspired by Nader's talk and by Nimi's discussion, is to think of universality and specificity in two different ways. Universality as in universally legible, that there is something or an architectural form or an urban form that we can all understand, although not necessarily that we can all produce. Because when we demand people to produce the same thing, here comes the act of oppression of essentially creating one form that we all need to produce. But we can produce very specific forms that remain entirely legible to the universe. So we can understand and read the different forms without being necessarily oppressed by it, but at the same time, we wouldn't be oppressed into producing something that doesn't really belong to us.
Let me comment on something like that. We'll go back. I fully understand. And certainly my intention was not dictatorial, far from it. But I'll give you an example.
The opposite, that's what I'm
exactly
saying. Yeah.
Let me give you an example. For instance, one of the archetypes that I would consider that might be pleasing to most people is the garden. It's an archetype. It doesn't exist. It's a thought in the mind. If you then say, and this is a quote from my friend Moshe Safdie actually, he says, for every person a garden. Okay? I'm talking about things like that. We wrote together something called the Habitat Bill of Rights 40 years ago, presented in Vancouver Habitat Conference that occurred in '76. And it was about these sort of things. For every person, a garden. For every person, a view. For every person, 2 openings in a room to allow cross ventilation. You know, these kinds of things. These are not oppressive. These are the type of things that get you back into contact with nature. And they're so generic, but yet the buildings that we do are boxes put on, like what Julio showed. Those big high-rise boxes in which you stuff people like fire drawers, and then when they die, you know, you put another file in.
We have last question.
Yeah, it's very funny, the collision of ideas that happen. In the late 60s, I was working for Grusin and Partners in New York, and we were given by John Lindsay a housing project in Queens that was the lowest income New York City housing, which was normally those repetitive
tower blocks.
And so it was a triangular, weird little site, and I took a plan for Michelangelo's ideal city, speaking of an archetype. It's a perfect square with open spaces, and overlaid it on this funny triangular site and designed Lindenwood housing, which won a Progressive Architecture Design citation in 1970. I was 25 years old. And the fascinating thing was that it used, instead of the style at the time, which was totally about air conditioners in every room, it was all about convection, cross-ventilation, recreating the kind of network pattern of the streets. So it was like taking a very wild archetype and translating it into a medium of the lowest common denominator of people at the very bottom of the economic scale, and it worked. And I think there's a lot of leverage in that, and there's a beauty to it in a funny way, you know, that kind of thing can really happen. It ended up getting vetoed by the Housing Authority because it came in under budget, and they felt that it would threaten the existing creators of this kind of architecture that had been going for 40 or 50 years in New York City. So it was very depressing, and it led me to leave architecture. Anyway.
Some final comments by our panelists?
I mean, the one question that is very interesting that has come up this morning is the creation of this awe that everywhere we seems to be from the early morning panel. And what I'm talking about, the charismatic city, is that consciousness that how do we design a city to do that? I mean, so it fits in with Tom's concept, because also in the ancient times, they would design the sacred places, the temples or the mosques or the church, so that you would have that encounter. And I'm saying that now that God or the divine or the ultimate concern is no longer confined to a room or a drawer or a certain holy of holies, and is now out on the street. How do you take that concept so that the city itself becomes a place for that awe? So that's why I call it the awephilic society. So it's not only biophilic, awephilic, because the biophilic can be a medium or an intermediary for the awephilic. You know, so how do you consciously design? Of course, we can't do much with existing cities, but you know, as we said, since cities are going to come up in the future, how do we have that concept that I'm going to design a city that is biophilic, and in being biophilic will exude or will promote awe and wonder, and people will have an emotional connection to the city, not just to make money and live and go to school, but the city will have a great emotional significance, because interactional, as sociology has shown, what they call interactional ritual chains, that human beings are emotion-seeking people. But I also believe that human beings are not only emotion-seeking, they're also awe-seeking people. And how do we create a city to recognize that aspect of their life, at least the moment they want to be opened up to that? It's not that day to day they will live in that kind of space or in that kind of experience. Thank you.
I'll just, yeah, Ahmed, you got me. thinking, because for me, I think we should always question how we're looking at things, and I'm have a real interest in language and the types of terms and the problem of how we define terms. And my question is always, according to whom? From what position? Now, taking a position is all we can do, right, both personally and architecturally. Right? We take a position in the world. And architecture, I think, and by extension urbanism, has always performed that role. And as a predominant cultural artifact, that's what really has drawn me to this subject. We see how much we have assigned to architecture. And that's why when I look at particularly state religious architecture, I'm as equally interested in its aspects of inspiration and the transcendent as I am in its didactic, declarative, and even coercive roles, because it speaks about what we have asked architecture to do. And I think that's actually a real hope in terms of, as complicated and multifarious as it may be, that language that we can understand. People have talked about the kind of universal language of art, and architecture, I think, as a predominant kind of cultural artifact, has that capacity. And maybe that's what I was at with the home. And while recognizing its limitations as a place, by its collective nature, and within that collective nature of the city. I mean, it's an incredible social contract, like language is, of cities. And within that, the amount of agreement that has to transpire to actually create a city. And we all know that when we try to build one little piece of housing or something and get handbagged by the grannies, right? And often legitimately so. Right? That it's difficult. There's negotiations that happen. But it's in those moments, right, that I think the whole world then opens up.
I have nothing to say.
So,
I think you need to turn it on.
I turned it on. Got green light. Anybody hear me? No. It is on. Okay. My question starts with a notion that a term that John Steele came up with, which was a kind of spiritual amnesia. And in the context of spiritual amnesia, I was really taken by your Olive and Ike diagram as in 210 primer. And I was hoping that you would read the bottom one, because the bottom one, this is paraphrasing, but it says something like, say leaf, say tree, say city, say now, say them, but in the end, say people. And I think all 6 of the presentations today have been floating in and out of the larger context and the smaller context of the individual. And so it's in that context that I kind of present my question, that it seems to me that this transformation out of this amnesia, and in the context of spirituality and urbanism, really has to do with the correspondence among the myriad of scales of spirituality and urbanism. So if we go from Nader's view of the cosmos to the region, to the city, to the neighborhood, to the house, to the room, to the bed, to the pillow, and each one of these offers an opportunity for us to break out of this amnesia. So I guess the question really has to do with expanding the question about this from just the larger collective to the individual, but rather to this gradient of multitudes of different kinds of cultural and cultural constructs that we have. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it's an essential way of framing it, so that we're not speaking generally. And this is a further conversation. What slice? Is this the, you know, the cosmogonic slice, or is this the, you know, the threshold to the home slice, you know, and everything that lies in between? Is that?
Ames's Power of 10, in a way, comes to mind.
Yeah.
And that, in a way, spirituality exists on all these 10 levels and more. So, and I think what we're doing as planners and architects are beginning to address some of these in some ways in a rather piecemeal way. Do this and we'll do that. And maybe it's the nature of the way that we do things. I don't know.
Yeah, give a comment to this. We've been saying to one another that we have been observing lately that there is a growing acceptance and a growing commentary being made about alternatives to the way we're living. And Harvey spoke about this when he gave the keynote on Thursday at the Abbey, and many other things, of course. I don't think we would have stayed all these hours, and yesterday I think we had presentations from 8:30 in the morning to 6 in the evening, and then we stayed until 10 and you know, put those notes
kept talking
together.
and drinking wine.
Yeah, well, that was the spirit, wasn't it? My feeling, to be honest with you, and I really want to thank Harvey and Ahmad for allowing us and bringing us to this room, and to Jack Spengler, if Jack is here, for supporting the idea. This group of architecture, culture, and spirituality began, as you heard, with individual people feeling this yearning to come together to address this issue. And the first time I got together, really when we had our first conference, I think we were about 30 people. And then this has grown to the fact that now we're about 280 people, and I hope through this we're even larger than that. My impression is I think this is the moment. We need to grab this moment and keep going with this, because it is only through education, through amplification, through demonstration that we need to share this. We have a moment. It's not every day that at Harvard you would bring the word urbanism and spirituality together. And we were able to do it because we found the elixir of well-being. It gave us the scientific, and as that very honest man, Julio, said, you had to use this lingo to allow the door, in a way, to a little creak in the door to open for us to get in. But now that we have opened this door, now that we're speaking about it, and we have this wonderful professor whose title is Religion and Science, we've got to keep on moving with this quest. And I believe that in ways that you can carry about this, you can care to speak about this, in your next conference, invite some of these people to speak there about this topic. Form other groups in which we carry on this type of dialogue. I mean, we have people from all over the world here. We have people from Russian Siberia, mashallah, this fine lady who spoke to us about ontological axis totem poles that are being built all around your city. Someone asked, how did this possibly preserve? How was this idea preserved under communism? Where did the grandmothers keep this knowledge when you were supposed to be flat and totally, removed? So something is kindled and kept, the fires. My impression is that if we leave here today and we say, well, it was very nice, but, boring. But we've got to actually act to teach this, to get it back down into, I think, elementary schools. Right down. And I visited my granddaughter and grandson in Albuquerque, and there they were. They were in a green school, and they were all actively involved with recycling and thinking. So I'm very hopeful. It's just that all of us have to, I think, keep moving with this, because it's the attitudinal change of our societies, of our individuals. We weren't like this a generation ago. Believe me, in the Gulf research we're doing, there are right now 3 fragmented societies. There is the grandfather who, when we interviewed, because we did these through interviews, said, gee, I don't know, I think I'm living in a virtual world. This world is completely alien. It's an alien world I'm living in. And then the son, the grandson said, wow, I love this world. I can get anywhere. I can travel anywhere. I can do anything. It's very exciting. So for him, this material, digital was the reality. And then there was the father who had in many ways been the culprit, who had allowed his society to be so transformed, because at the time it was being transformed, it was considered as advancement. And so he lived in an old courtyard house. He tore it down. He moved out into the suburb, became a sprawl commuter person, and he left his city. And nobody's ever gone back really to live in Kuwait City, you know. So we've done this not only to this little case study of Kuwait, but everywhere, because we got the idea in our head that this is advancement. And we got this really from this beautiful America, because after World War II, we educated the world. And the world said, gee, I like this place. I want to be just like you, Dad. And the issue that has evolved is, now that we're living like us, Dad, we need 3 Earths, because we're a consumptive society. And we cannot keep this way. So really, we, this leading country in the world, must do much more as an example of what we need to do. And we are doing it. Yes, we're using less energy. We are doing this. We are, you know, but we need to do it, I think, as someone said, much more clearly, much more drastically. Who was it? Who did the graph? You did the graph. You said that even if we follow all these, say what you said. What did you say?
You're doing an excellent job.
No, he took all the ideas that we have about green building, etc., and he graphed it in terms of, would we meet the criteria to be able to, I don't know, not get to, well, we're already past 350 parts per million. We're already at 400.
Yeah.
All right. So we will not be able to meet. This is like doomsday coming, and it really means that we have to have significant change in our attitudes, etc. And it comes from the individual. It doesn't come from, you know, any rule or law, etc. Because we found that it doesn't happen by edict, as you were saying. It happens by the aspect of people feeling that for the love of your grandchild, you've got to do it, and for the love of yourself and the genetic survival of mankind. So I just want to say, please, this, I believe, as to quote Paul Tezar, he said, this is a historic moment. We've got to take this much more seriously and do something about it. So I hope that that's something as a takeaway for all of you. And I know this is something that Ahmad will say at the end, but all those who have traveled such far distances at their own expense to be here, please know that we need to keep linked with each other and sharing with each other about what we've learned here, what we've said to each other, and perhaps there might be some, you know, little light that we shine onto these rather darker issues.
I think this is a great. I think this is a great conclusion to the panel. Thank you, Nader. We will reconvene at 4:30 for the closing remarks by Harvey. Thank you.
I have one very important and very theological statement to make. The end is near. The end is near. It is upon us. I'm standing here thinking about a conversation that occurred almost 2 years ago now, when Nader Ardalan and I were brought together by our mutual student, Antonio Petrov. Tell us, put your hand up, Antonio. Sometimes students do that sort of thing. He said to me, hey, you really ought to meet Nader. I think he said to me, you ought to meet Arby. So we met at a Persian restaurant called Kalbe over here in Cambridge, and we talked with each other, and it was such a lively and wonderful conversation. We said, this we have to expand and continue. We need to think about the future of cities and the future of our planet from a spiritual perspective. So into the conversation came Jack Spengler, and came Julia Africa, and came Ahmed Ragab, and then others and more, and then all of you. So I think of what's happening today as a kind of culmination of a conversation, a beautiful, wonderful, memorable culmination, but also as the commencement of a much, much longer conversation that Nader alluded to in his final remarks here today. This is really going to grow. This is going to expand. This isn't going to stop here. And many of you will be back here. We'll be with other people continuing a conversation about how we can do better in constructing this immense new global city that we have to construct, how we can do better than we've done in the past. That's a very simple thing. We haven't done very well. We have separated people from each other. We've separated men and women, and old and young, and sick and well, black and white, gated communities of all kinds. We haven't built cities that facilitate friendship. Animi, we haven't done that. At least we can hope for cities that don't prevent friendship from developing. At the very least, cities that make it possible for friendship, which I agree with you. It has to be the kind of network that keeps the city going and which contributes to its emotional appeal, to the emotional significance of our city. We've experienced some of that here in Cambridge, as you might imagine, in the last few months, or in the city of Boston, with the horrible events here connected with the Boston Marathon. Almost a kind of a blasphemy. A blasphemy. The Boston Marathon is one of the most beautiful rituals in American life. People from all over the world come together and compete with each other fiercely. And then at the end, covered with perspiration, they hug and kiss each other. And those bombs exploded right behind a whole bank of flags indicating all the different countries that participated in the marathon. It was an act of a kind of a blasphemy against an urban ritual, if you will, celebrating a kind of spirituality, an international spirituality that isn't just located here. But one of the things that I noticed in the last few weeks, speaking about the emotional connection with the city, was they're not going to keep Boston down. We'll be back next year. There'll be even more participants in the marathon. There'll be hundreds and thousands and more. There will be next year. Strong. Be strong was the slogan that came out of it. Boston, be strong. So many, many words are jumping around in my mind. My colleague said, now, it's going to be your task at the end of all this to give the final remarks. All you have to do is sum up 46 different papers in 3 times. And you have to do it just when everybody's dead tired and they want to get out to the fresh air, or they want to have a glass of wine, or they want to have both. And I'm sure you can do it well. Sum it all up and send them off with a zinger. Well, you'll have to make up your own zingers. I think you all have some of them in your mind from these wonderful and eloquent panels, and this terrific insight into the kind of research, hard empirical research, that's supporting what many of us have just thought about in very theological and very theoretical terms. I'm enormously grateful for that part, and also encouraged. Now, what I do want to say in closing, however, is this. We don't have to invent a spiritual renaissance. It is happening. It's happening all around us. It's happening all around the world. I talked a little bit about this on Thursday evening. It's, for me, an evidence of grace. Yes, call it the secular city, whatever you want to call it. I'm glad to see that it wasn't completely erased by the charismatic city. It's being incorporated into the charismatic city. A little shape-shifting is going on here. I'm all in favor of that. No, there is something in the wind, there's something in the air that we just have to be sensitive to and open to. When I read the parables of Jesus, none of Jesus' parables talk very much about God. They say, look at what's happening right under your nose. Just look at what's happening under your nose, and you will see that the kingdom of God is in the midst of you. In the midst of you. I firmly believe that. But I also think we need to welcome that effervescence of spirit, if you will, that rebirth of spirit. It's taking a new form. I talked about that Thursday night. It's not quite like the old spirituality. I think I said something like it's more open. It's more. There's a porousness with reference to other religious traditions than the one is in. An openness to borrowing and hospitality, if you will, that didn't used to be there in these traditions, which thought of themselves as more or less exclusive. It's turning very much toward experience and away from doctrine and institution, and that's across the board, whether you're talking about Islam or Christianity or Buddhism or Judaism, across the board. And when I live here in this wonderful university with students, I've been here for 4 decades, I can see this hunger for a vital spiritual life, but a deep suspicion of the kind of scaffolding, the confinement within which these spiritual traditions have often been handed on. I welcome this new kind of spirituality. I think it has some dangers, but I welcome it, and I hope we can welcome it with the way we construct our homes and our cities. So I hope we carry that away, if you will. There are a lot of things buzzing around in my mind from these panels. I'll tell you, I want to be especially grateful to, I guess it was Alan Logan, first of all, who said that rather than having a well-trimmed lawn, you should have something that's kind of raggedy and bushes out there. Didn't you say that? It's better for the spirit, it's better for mental health. Boy, do I want to know here's what I'm going to tell my wife. You haven't mowed the lawn while I've been gone? Oh no, dear. I haven't mowed the lawn because I now know it's much healthier for my mental health. It deepens my spirit to have that raggedy lawn out there. Let's just sell that lawnmower and enjoy nature. So I want to be appreciative of that remark. And I think I hope it's well documented in the experimental work you're doing. Please send me the data so I can domestic dispute about this. One last remark is this, and it has to do with somebody, I think it may have been Nader at the very end, talking about the sickness of what you called, I think, the consumptive society, the society which is oriented toward and really motivated toward consuming without limit. Without limit. Think about it for a moment. I think what you said, we need 3 planets if we keep up with this. We only have 1. It's that tiny little blue speck that we saw when the space vehicle took that picture. That's the only one we have. And we're using it up. And we have an economic system which is built on and requires constant, eternal, infinite growth. Growthism has become a kind of a cancerous intrusion into the body politic. If you don't grow, you die. Like the shark, if you don't move, you die. Now we have to find alternatives to that, or we're not going to have any kinds of cities. let alone healthy cities or spiritual cities in the future. There has to be something, some alternative to what I call the era of the market God, when the market has, in fact, taken the place of God in many people's lives. Think about it. The market is what we're told we should count on. It may not look like it's doing very well for us right now, but just be patient. As the old hymn goes, further along we'll understand why. When the market sorts itself out and makes its allocations, the market knows best for us. The market is wise, the market is omniscient, the market is more and more omnipresent now. It is really the God of our era, and it has a whole range of religious accoutrements. Stories, parables, myths, narratives, values, and we absorb them. We absorb them every single day. And it's a religion which is in sharp contrast to any of the traditional religions that I know about. Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. So I think we need to enter a period in which there's more creative tension between the religious communities of the world and this market religion. There have been such creative periods in the past. We have in American Christianity the tradition of the social gospel. In recent years, we've had something called liberation theology coming out of the poor slums and ghettos of South America, challenging the assumptions of the market mentality. But there have been kind of minor themes. And I'm convinced that we need a much more major theme in this regard, for everything we've talked about here. So hopefully, so prayerfully, it will be defeated. So that's about all I want to say. I thought I'd like to really leave you with an enormously profound insight from the great magisterial work on the city and spirituality, namely St. Augustine's The City of God. So I took down my copy of The City of God a couple days ago and thumbed through it to see if I could find something that would really end this conference with a, not with a whimper, but with a bang, so to speak. And what leaped out at me finally was the very last sentence of De Civitate Dei. And I want to read it to you with one substitution, because I think this says exactly what I hope all of us are feeling now. Augustine is talking himself about the work that he's just written and how he hopes it goes over to those who are reading it. So I've merely substituted the word we for all of us here for the word I in the original text. I'm sure St. Augustine will appreciate that change. And where he is now, he knows why we do these kinds of things, I'm sure, and will forgive and understand why I'm editing his text just a little bit with we instead of I. And here's what he says. We think we have now, by God's help, discharged our obligation. Let those who think we have said too little, or those who think we have said too much, forgive us. And let those who think we have said just enough join us in giving thanks to God. Amen. Thank you all, and amen.